Hello and welcome to another edition of the One Drink Book Club. Today we're going to be discussing Rogue Heroes, the history of the SAS, Britain's secret special forces unit that sabotaged the Nazis and changed the nature of war, a book by Ben Macintyre. My guest tonight is Ken Braun, an old colleague and friend who has recommended several great history books and books about the military to me in the past. And as the incredibly long and descriptive title of this book tells us, it is about the start of an unconventional British commando group that conducts a guerrilla war against the Germans and the Italians, with the action occurring in North Africa and throughout Europe. Welcome, Ken. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here, Jamie. Glad I made the cut and passed the audition.
Well, of course you did. You have, as I mentioned, you have recommended several great books to me in the past, and usually on a topic that I had very little to knowledge of. So I always enjoy kind of learning some new stuff when I read things.
Yeah, I generally, with a couple of exceptions, read books on topics that I have very little knowledge of, and this was certainly one of them.
So, just a general impression. What did you think of this?
Oh, I loved it. It was a lot of fun. It reminded me of a couple of other historical books of actually a later era that I've read regarding the Vietnam War, which we can get into a little bit. But it dovetailed nicely with the storylines in some of those.
Yeah, what struck me, it really felt like a novel and
Mhm.
not necessarily like a historical, recording of true facts. I mean, some of the stories inside there were incredible, and the characters too were straight out of Hollywood. And so it didn't surprise me that they've now kind of turned this into a series. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't until you referenced it earlier today to me. I didn't even know that, but I will definitely check it out. I did read Ben McIntyre's A Spy Among Friends probably shortly after it came out, and that was turned into a mini series with Damian Lewis playing uh, Philby's friend, British friend from the novel, and that was done very well. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I've actually read several of Ben McIntyre's books, "Spy Among Us,"
Oh, my,
"A Spy
among
Among
us,
Friends." I mean, yeah,
yeah.
"The Spy and the Traitor" and "Agent Zigzag." I think are the ones that I've read, and he's got a lot more. He does incredible research,
Hmm.
and I think he puts these together really well. I can't imagine how tough it is to read all these war diaries, all these official reports about things, and then craft a narrative.
And as you said, Spy Among Friends also came off very novel like, not dry history, but really brought the story alive. And secondary difficulty in what you're saying, in a lot of cases, I mean, it's getting a little on in years, but in a lot of cases, he's writing about people who are still alive or just recently passed and have family that could contradict him if he, you know, screws something up. So it makes it extra hard.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It's a little different if you're talking, trying to write about George Washington
Yeah.
or somebody like that. The other big question that needs to be answered is, what did you make as your drink tonight?
Yeah, that one. I given the insane drinking that Patty Main did, I could never match that. But I was trying to think of something that would come close enough. I mean, I when I was drinking hard liquor back in the day, I was not inclined to get into fights, but climb buildings and do other outrageous things. And fortunately, I'm older than the 40 years old that Patty Main made it to, and have calmed down a bit. So I looked it up. He was from Ireland. He was an Irish Protestant, and I thought I was right. But Guinness was founded by an Irish Anglican gentleman named I forgot his name. Anyway, forgot what Mr. Guinness's name was. At any rate, so I got Guinness Extra Stout, which is the heavier version of it, just to meet Patty halfway.
I was also tempted by Patty Main, and so I looked at doing an Irish car bomb, which seemed to
Ah,
be kind of very apt for his personality. But I also just didn't want to make a giant mess over my desk, so I I rethought it and decided to go with the quintessential British drink and made myself gin and tonic.
Okay.
So, and the only fancy part of my gin and tonic is that I used a lime that I grew myself on my lime tree.
Oh, nice.
So
Very good.
I always feel like, I mean, gin and tonics are always so refreshing,
Hmm. I
and
I would have gone with that if I'd have thought of it. Yeah, that's the I like those.
yeah. Um, so you read a lot. Do you tend to read or do you listen to
I
books?
I sometimes prior to podcasts such as this awesome one becoming more of my routine. I used to read or listen to books and read them. Now almost exclusively I read them on my Kindle.
Nice, nice. This one, usually I overall I'm super impressed with the quality of voiceover talents on these books. Ben Macintyre decided to read this particular book himself, which I generally frown on the author doing that. The authors tend to be very good at writing. They don't always, they aren't always really good at reading out
Hmm.
loud. I'd say my one big exception on that is Rob Lowe's book, because clearly Rob Lowe knows how to
Trained,
do a
yeah.
voiceover and how to do that. So the only I listened to it. It was totally fine, but I think it would have benefited from a true voiceover talent, and I think he did because I listened to A Spy Among Friends, and I think he did have somebody who was. I don't think that was him on that one.
I should add there is one caveat to what I've said. I will occasionally, if I've already read a book, like a very good Generation Kill, the book about the First Marine Recon Division going into Iraq. Um, if I've read a book that I really enjoy, I have in some cases, if I've got a long car ride, drive to Florida or something crazy, will get the audio and listen to it again or something like that.
Sure,
I
sure.
still occasionally do it.
Well, as I mentioned in the intro, you are definitely somebody. If I'm thinking of a friend who likes historical records and especially military related stuff, I definitely think of you. Are there stuff? Are there recommendations that you've read recently that you would say, "Hey, you definitely check this out"?
Um, so I guess this book, which we can discuss why, but it was kind of the inverse of something. I didn't read it recently, but I've read it recent enough that I remember the gist of it. It was a biography of General William Westmoreland called Westmoreland, the General Who Lost Vietnam by Lewis Sorley. And General Westmoreland is about as polar opposite of everyone involved in the making of the SAS that you can possibly imagine. Very conventional thinker, not a terribly curious man, really, really into following the rules. He would have worn like four masks during COVID. And, he was just a terribly boring, conventional person. He became the head of cadets at West Point and really showed his later proclivity for charts and graphs and record keeping because one of his proudest accomplishments, and he could prove it with the data, was that he got the West Point band to lose weight. Real exciting guy like this tried to ban Playboy subscriptions from being mailed into West Point because it was lascivious and licentious content, he said. And until he was informed that even the head of the superintendent of West Point could not interdict the U.S. mail. So compare him to Patty Main and Dave Sterling and that crew who didn't really have any respect for rules at all. I found that a good pairing book to put with that. One that I actually did read recently that, for one reason or another, made me think of this book was called Off the Wall Death in Yosemite. It was about all of the creative ways people have managed to kill themselves since Yosemite National Park was created, written by a former park ranger and another, I think the guy was a rock climber, wrote in conjunction with it. Um, Relation to this book, there were lots of stories in this that related to it, but one of them, the authors didn't have a lot of respect for. I mean, they had a lot of respect for rock climbers who generally safer people, even though dangerous pursuit, don't like base jumpers at all. And they told one story of a base jumper who was made himself famous for not being captured after he had done these things. So naturally, he decides to do this off of El Capitan in Yosemite Valley, which literally has like one exit point, one road that you can get out of. So it's really hard. You can't even steal a car in Yosemite Valley without getting caught. So this guy makes his jump and he gets surrounded and decides still not, makes the jump safely. The parachute, unlike some of the other folks in the story, doesn't get tangled up. He doesn't hit a tree, anything like this. Gets surrounded, takes off, hightails, and this is only a few years ago, and ends up jumping in the Merced River, which is another way to escape because that flows rapidly out of the valley. Somewhat too rapidly, he got trapped against a rock and drowned. So,
Well, that sounds like
reminded
a
me.
delightfully uplifting book.
Oh, I could go on and on about it. It reminded me of this one only because, well, the kind of lack of attention to rules that the base jumper had, plus the fact that in this book, even though this is about paratroopers, they get most successful when they quit using the parachutes and use the long dist or LDR. I forgot what those guys are called. Anyway, and it seems like every time they jump out of parachutes in throughout the entire book, something bad happens. They get dropped behind, into the middle of enemy troops that grab them. They break things. They get lost. They get separated. Horrible things happen whenever these guys jump out of parachutes, even though they're paratroopers. So
Yeah,
that's what.
the Special
Yeah,
Air Service was a bad name for the
exactly.
group. Anytime that they used the air, they ended up really messing things up. I thought that was pretty
Exactly.
funny.
Exactly.
Well, I ask everybody this: when you rate the book on a scale of 1 to 5, what would you rate this book?
Surely a four. I enjoyed it. I wouldn't credit it as, oh my gosh, one of the greatest books I've ever read, but there's been a lot of them, and it's a small list. It certainly kept me entertained. I was sad to see it done. I envy anybody who's picking it up the first time. That's to me the standard of a good book. I wasn't, when's this going to be over with? I bought it and invested time in it. I mean, that's more than half of the books I read are drudgery like that. But like I said, I read another book from the same author. I think I enjoyed A Spy Among Friends tad bit more, but this is certainly a piece of history I was unaware of, and like I said, reminded me a lot of the Vietnam histories I've read from the one that I just mentioned, but the SAS look pure Viet Cong in their actions and um, in their foibles as well. And I read a
Definitely
lot about Vietnam history, so that's why.
interesting. Uh, well, I wonder the thing that I often, if I'm reading nonfiction, uh, there are times where I feel like I'm taking my medicine, where it's like
Yeah,
I'm getting ready for a test. We're going to be really glad to get it done, and then I'm going to read something I enjoy. And this one didn't have that feel, and none of Ben McIntyre's have had that feel. And so the fact that he is able to craft a narrative and a storyline that makes it feel more like a novel, I think is a real talent for
yeah.
sure.
I don't read a lot of nonfiction, and um, plots kind of disappoint me a lot of times. But you are correct. The the fiction, the real, the nonfiction books, especially history books, even when I'm interested in the subject and getting good stuff out of it, there aren't a large number of very talented writers like this one Macintyre who can hold your interest all the way through, and you don't feel like you're working to finish it because you started. Which
Right.
happens more often than not, unfortunately.
Well, we talked about you've done a lot of the history, you've done a lot of Vietnam. I've done a lot of historical fiction about World War II, as well as some nonfiction about World War II. But I had no idea about the SAS, and I also had no knowledge of the North African aspect, and I'll explain if you haven't read this book. A lot of the beginning of the SAS revolved around the fact that the Germans and the Italians had essentially taken all over all of North Africa, and the British and the Allies were kind of stuck in Egypt around Cairo, and they were trying to move west and take over these air bases and some of the supply lines they had in North Africa, because the Axis powers could attack Europe and attack the Mediterranean from these bases in North Africa. And the big idea that David Sterling, who was the founder of the SAS, was that, hey, we could get airplanes to drop us in the desert that is south of these air bases, and they would never expect us to attack from their southern flank. And so we could surprise them, and we could blow up airplanes on the ground and cause some havoc. And as you mentioned, once they discovered, they had kind of an epiphany, because when they got dropped from airplanes, people ended up getting off target. They'd get lost in the desert. They would break their legs, all sorts of things. But there was this long range motorized group that would come pick them up. They had figured out how to drive Jeeps and other trucks through the desert by deflating the tires and doing these modifications to the engine. And they finally thought, well, geez, if these guys can pick us up when we get dropped by the airplanes, maybe they could just drive us in and we don't have to drop out of airplanes. And that was kind of a big epiphany there, which was a cool aspect. But did you know much about the North African part of the World War II?
Um, just what I saw in Patton, I guess. I mean, I haven't
Yeah.
read a lot of World War II history, and I knew the SAS were the British special operators. Knew nothing really about their history. I mean, I think I can say now I know as much or more about the British special operators history than I do about the American the American version. So
um, well, and as you said, these guys didn't were complete uh, rogues. In the title is a great title, the Rogue Heroes, in that they had no respect for authority at all, and
mhm.
they were able to talk their way into getting kind of this separate group that was not really accountable to anybody, and they just kind of hung out in the desert and begged, borrowed, and stole equipment, and went in and wreaked havoc in some of these uh, air bases for the Germans and the Italians. Um, there were so many great little like mini uh, missions that they did that I thought were really just unbelievable. Were there any that stood out from you in the story that you thought, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that"?
Yeah, so the first half of the book is about their adventures in the desert that you're mentioning, and their first adventures. And in that case, the book really read like a combat version of MASH in its just audacious craziness. They weren't really suffering big casualties. They were pulling off amazing raids, and the I think the signature event was their unsuccessful attempt to raid Benghazi, when they decorated up their truck to look like a German vehicle, and or it was a German. They painted it up and basically rode their way into Benghazi, speaking German to an Italian, at the Italian supposed allies, convinced the Italians that they were Germans. And warning them of the British that were going to raid the base, i.e., them pretending to be the Germans, and it became so convincing that they eventually had Italian troops following them, looking for them, but not realizing that they were, and just bluffing their way through and dressing down the border, the guards on the base. And I forget exactly why it was that they couldn't plant their bombs and blow up the place, but they bluffed their way all through this town and out the back, and never got caught. And it was more actually not MASH, Kelly's Heroes, if you've seen that movie. It had that kind of feel to it, so I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I could not believe the amount of bluffing they would do. They would, pretend they were Germans, pretend they were Italians, and they just had so much. I mean, they were just so cocky that they got away with it. And I thought at one point they discover a giant collection of these heavy machine guns that I think are supposed to be mounted on airplanes, and
Anti-aircraft guns.
they figure out that they can mount them to their American Jeeps, and they turn these Jeeps into these crazy weapons where they drive down the runways of these air bases. They break into the air base and then just shoot up every plane that's sitting in the tarmac there, and it was
With, with,
unbelievable.
with anti-aircraft guns mounted on vehicles that they're driving like at almost stall speed for the Jeeps, and yeah, just parading down. I mean, I was hoping at some point that I'd hear jokes of them putting, the little air-to-air kill stickers on the outside of the Jeeps. It was, I mean, these were supposed to be paratroopers. I put a note in the book. We started out jumping out of airplanes and planting bombs, and now these guys are just driving slowly across airfields, firing anti-aircraft guns directly at empty planes, and how the evolution of their success and the level of it was just maddening. I mean, that 70 planes destroyed, one guy sprained an ankle or something crazy would happen. Yeah, the first half of the book was you know not gory and a lot of fun.
Absolutely, and it was like a giant commercial for Jeeps too. I mean,
Yeah, it
it
was.
made Jeep seem like the most indispensable, awesome tool in the British armory. Uh,
Yeah.
um, some of the characters too. Clearly, the SAS wouldn't have come about without David Sterling.
hmm
You mentioned Patty Main, who was also another really interesting character. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that somebody who was so irreverent and hated authority like Patty Main, and had obviously was an alcoholic and had a huge temper, was able to rise to a level where he was commanding. At one point, I think he was the leader of a battalion. Like, it was insane.
Yeah, and kind of bristling at his own authority at that point, insisting on jumping in and joining his troops when he was being told to stay home. Um, I think what doesn't get brought out enough in the book. I mean, not the author's fault, but it kind of gets overshadowed by the rest of Maine's personality. Is that he was apparently a very charismatic person, and people just loved to follow him. Also, he was a lawyer. He was very well read. All of these things are listed in the book, but you kind of forget them as you're hearing about the bombastic and violent temper and all the rest of it. I mean, clearly a just boundlessly intelligent man who kept learning. Compare him to Westmoreland, who throughout that book you are repeatedly reminded that Westmoreland didn't like to read, period, and was kind of proud of it. So that I think is an important caveat to Patty Maine's character, is that he, you know, had a lot more going on that didn't necessarily fit the battlefield in all cases.
Yeah, I think towards the end they mentioned that he ended up being one of the most decorated soldiers in during World War II in the British Army. Like,
Mhm.
um, he truly, and he seemed almost unstoppable. His ability to not die in a number of situations where somebody was trapped and he went and rescued them, or he would. There's a scene in it where he basically opens the door of a hut that has 30 or 40 guys in it, and just stands there with a Tommy gun and throws in a couple of grenades and just stands there in the doorway shooting people.
Mhm.
I mean, it was kind of an Indiana Jones type character for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And interesting in that. I mean, as I recall, that was during the desert campaign portion of the story, where not a lot of, I mean, a lot of equipment is getting destroyed, but not a lot of enemy contact is happening. That was a complete obverse of that. It was an instance where Patty Main just decided to jump in and initiate contact. I think he ended up, it was a bunch of pilots that he took out too, if I remember that particular
Yeah.
story right. So
Yeah.
he really, did his fair of damage to equipment as well, in that they didn't have anybody to fly the planes that were being destroyed and then replaced. So, but yeah, he was um,
One man wrecking crew.
that he was.
Was there anybody else character wise that stood out to you as memorable?
Yeah, I liked Roy Farron, the uh, Foreign Office employee who, as the war starts, gets irritated that the Foreign Office won't release him from his employment because this was considered really important to something, and there were regulations to be followed. And because of his family position, he discovered that he had a darn good chance of running for parliament and winning. And once winning, a member of parliament, was immediately dispatched from any commitments to things like working for the Foreign Office. So he literally ran for office and won the office because he wanted to go to war, which is sort of the opposite of what we think of as for the why people become politicians. And then that personality was proven out later on when he was leading, commanding troops and ordered to stay back and not to go out into the field. And as close as they would let him go is to ride in the airplane with the guys when they were going to jump. And he claimed to have accidentally fallen out of the plane and ended up running around Europe with them, disobeying orders flagrantly to not do things, ended up blowing up and destroying a whole lot of valuable Nazi equipment, which ended up, even though he was disobeying orders horribly, he was highly successful and narrowly avoided a court martial. So, yeah, typical to the other leadership characters in the book. Incredibly successful and not at all taken with authority.
I
I
can't
think there's a
imagine.
lot of good management lessons in this book.
Well, I can't imagine trying to manage the group of people that they put together. I mean, clearly they were picking people who hated authority, wanted to do their own thing, and were pretty smart too. It really did not follow any of the rules of normal military
And
working.
it gets more cumbersome as they won. The first SAS ends up with 2,500 guys at one point. I mean, the logistic, once you get that, you start getting big, you become a logistical problem that you don't have when you're that small raiding party running around in the desert. And all of the things that makes it work start to, as you say, start to cause more problems than perhaps they solve. So
Yeah, I think one of my other characters that I liked outside of the David Sterling, Patty Main crowd was Mike Sadler, who was the desert navigator and who was like almost just clairvoyant in his ability to navigate these wide stretches of desert and get basically put everybody exactly where they need to be and do it by the stars, by very little information. And a lot of this area that they were traveling in was actually unmapped. Like nobody had been there.
and it all looked, what are you going to follow? There's not Everything looks the same except when it doesn't, because the sand is constantly changing the terrain. And yeah, I mean, I can't follow my way around a national park without a trail, whatever that thing is I use, that GPS mapping thing. And here's this guy running around a desert that looks different depending on how hard the wind blew the night before. And yeah, amazing stuff.
Yeah, I thought he was impressive. Um, the book has, to me, I thought the book had about two distinct areas. There was the David Sterling, the start of the SAS, and then all of the activity in Africa. And then David Sterling, not to give anything away, but he gets captured and is no longer in the leadership. And then all of the action moves to Europe. So it's a whole different theater of war. The style changes. Um, is there one of those sections that you liked more than the other?
I thought the first section was a lot more fun. Like I said, more moments of comic levity are happening in that section. More just I thought it was unrealistic. I mean, I know it really happened, but as far as how warfare usually works, it doesn't come off that clean. I mean, they were in a really unique place in history. They really weren't in a theater of war. They were able to just make these raids. They had this desert between them and their pursuers, and um, they just had a very unique opportunity that Sterling correctly discovered and made the most of it. They were attacking, they were blowing up equipment. There wasn't, even though there were, kills that were happening, they were fewer and far between. When they get into Europe, it becomes more of what warfare is, and they begin, they see children dead on the sides of the streets. There were no children in Africa. They are find more. They're taking heavier casualties. They're being redeployed in different as recon forces rather than as these raiding parties that are kind of making their own decisions, and in some cases they have to fight defensive actions. Then when they get into Germany, they've got, literally children fighting against them, and it just becomes, and the Macintyre is very good at talking about that transition and how it really begins to weigh on some of these guys in ways that wasn't happening in the earlier part of it. So I found the second half of it much more um, conventional. Is not the. I mean, it's an amazingly well told story. I wasn't having just as much rah rah fun reading it. It ceased being a comedy, and it was now more of a very serious war drama. So it was a very useful thing. I I I guess I enjoyed them both equally, but for just vastly different reasons.
Yeah, I thought you're right. There was more lightheartedness in the first half, and they were almost like fraternity guys
Hmm.
out at a party,
Making
and
pranks, yeah.
yeah,
They were,
and it got really. I mean, clearly people were dying. I mean, they had colleagues that died, and
hmm
um, in the Africa section, but it got a lot more brutal when they got into Europe, and when they saw some of the abuses that the Nazis were doing to citizens, as you mentioned, the kids and everything else, and citizens that were just getting mowed down, who were non-combatants and things like that.
yeah. I
I
mean,
always,
and also, I mean, by that point, the Nazis were also Hitler ordered every SAS, every paratrooper captured was going to be just put down. Weren't going to take prisoners, which I figure I suspect was more counterproductive than successful as a way of deterring them. I mean, makes them want to fight harder if they're near to being captured. But yeah, it was much more serious business the closer they got to Germany, and then once they got in Germany, and I mean they liberate a concentration camp. I mean it's rough stuff.
that was an amazing scene. It was a good way to kind of close out the book, is that they liberated this concentration camp, but that they were to hear their reports of how they felt what they saw and how amazed they were at the brutality when they found that camp that was still being guarded. The guards were still there, um, and the commandant of the camp was still there, and did not seem. They were so used to the situation that they didn't act either embarrassed or shameful or anything. They just kind of were standing around. It was bizarre.
In one case, killed a prisoner who was breaking the rules in the presence of the the commandos that were taking the camp. I mean, clearly there and taking over the camp. Yeah, I that was surreal. I think an entire book could be written just about that day, from his portrayal of how the everybody was behaving. But yeah, the guards of the camp in particular, what what kind of warped mindset they must have been in at that point to do to behave like that. Like I said, should be another book.
Yeah, what always strikes me about especially World War II things where you had a pretty massive draft, a lot of people who were in the army that would not necessarily join the military. Right now, we have a professional military. People who join the army fit into a certain class, either age or profession, um, more so than when you had an open draft or you had a lot of the population enlisting. And it always makes me kind of wonder. I think about the people I work with, the people I know. All right, if we were all shoved into uh, an army brigade, what would be the personalities? How would these people act? Who would be the successful soldiers? Who would not be? And I guess you really never know how people would react to that kind of stress, that kind of situation, until you're there. But it strikes me as so bizarre to take a school teacher, a lawyer, a typist, a construction worker, and then say, okay, now you're all soldiers and you are going to be in these life-threatening situations, and now you have to be brave, you have to be creative, you have to be aggressive. It's just kind of a bizarre situation.
Yeah, my dad was drafted into Vietnam at the ripe old age of 26. He did everything he could to avoid it and as a result of doing everything he could to avoid it by going to college and getting married and whatnot, by the time he gets drafted at age 26, it's late 19. He gets sent to Vietnam just in time for the Tet Offensive, and but he's able to, he can type. He's a company clerk for actually some special operators, but he has guys under him that are in charge of supplying things and whatnot. And most of them are younger than, a lot younger than he is. He's a sergeant at this point. And so after spending all this time doing everything he can to avoid this, my mom says when he got back, took him a long time to adjust to not having the responsibility anymore for, and he wasn't in, combat situations all the time, really at all. He was being brought into situations after battles were over to, you know, set up supply stuff and whatnot. But with people working underneath him, that he was responsible for making sure they didn't do something stupid, and then came home and civilian life, even after a year, civilian life was, slower and less responsible. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, clearly, we have started to pay a lot more attention to that kind of transition, and trying to help people come out of those situations with the mental health uh, treatments that they need, and the adjustments they need. But I
My
can't.
dad became a repo man in Detroit when he got home, so I don't know if it worked.
Well, I think it was still pretty bad in the '70s, and I think there's a long way to go now. But I think it's at least acknowledged that it's a bigger problem. Um, well, do you have anything on your nightstand, Ken, that you're looking forward to reading? What's your next book?
I guess the contemporary things going on right now, the biography of Elon Musk that Walter Isaacson is coming out with sometime soon is interesting to me, just because you talk about personality. I guess I'm drawn to personalities that don't like rule following. Elon's definitely that, and it's done wondrous things for him. So that's the only thing that springs to mind offhand that I think I'll get as soon as it comes out.
Well, I just finished a book, and I'm going to be doing a podcast on it called "The Last Kings of Shanghai." The Last Kings of Shanghai, and it's about two Jewish families that both had immigrated from Baghdad. They were Iraqi Jews in the 17 and 1800s, became British citizens, were hugely involved in the opium trade when China was being opened and abused by the West, and then were largely responsible for in the 1930s and early 40s the development of Shanghai. A
Wow.
lot of those old Art Deco buildings. One person, Victor Sassoon, was at the time probably the richest person in Asia, if not the world, and he had incredible real estate holdings in China, in Shanghai. Uh, they did textiles. They did they still were doing some opium, but just had this incredibly huge network of industries. And then it talks about those two families and then what happened during World War II as Jews were trying to escape Europe. Shanghai was one of the few places they could go without a visa, and the two families helped those people. So a really fascinating book. I'm looking forward to talking about it, but I think you'd probably enjoy it.
Yeah, I have heard nothing of the story,
Yeah,
let
it's
alone the book.
all right. For if you're listening, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're trying to do these about every 2 weeks. And Ken, thank you so much for taking the time. And I enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed talking about it with you.
Likewise, looking forward to my next assignment, Jamie. It's been fun.